¿Los arrestos en Los Ángeles no fueron redadas migratorias? Una declaración que lo cambia todo. Y una investigación criminal con posibles vínculos en México. ¿Está el nuevo gobierno de Claudia Sheinbaum detrás de estos disturbios? Algunos aseguran que esto podría ser una declaración de guerra. Soy Pachi Valencia y le cuento todos los detalles en Desde el Capitolio. Buenas noches, soy Pachi Valencia. Bienvenidos a Desde el Capitolio, en directo desde Washington, D.C. Los Ángeles sigue viviendo su quinta noche consecutiva de caos. Las calles han sido escenario de saqueos, incendios y disturbios que parecen no tener fin. Y ahora la tensión se está ampliando a otras ciudades. Veamos a San Francisco, por ejemplo, donde miles salieron a protestar ayer lunes de forma pacífica, pero al caer la noche, dos grupos rompieron el orden y desataron actos delictivos. Mientras que en Los Ángeles, algunos funcionarios no dudan en llamar a estos manifestantes anarquistas. La presidenta del quinto distrito del condado de Los Ángeles, Catherine Barger, advirtió que estas protestas violentas buscan desmantelar por completo la aplicación de la ley. Mientras que aquí, en Washington, D.C., los demócratas están culpando al presidente Donald Trump por esta escalada de violencia. Mientras que los republicanos responden que esto demuestra por qué el Congreso debe aprobar cuanto antes la propuesta de Trump, el One Big Beautiful Bill. Pero entre todo este cruce de acusaciones hay una declaración que lo ha cambiado todo. Tom Homan, el zar de la frontera, reveló que los agentes del ICE no realizaban redadas migratorias el viernes. Según dijo el funcionario, estaban ejecutando órdenes judiciales dentro de una investigación federal por fraude aduanero, evasión fiscal y lavado de dinero. Fueron arrestadas 41 personas y en este operativo también participaron el FBI, la DEA y el Servicio de Impuestos Internos. Pero eso no es todo. Homan aseguró que estas detenciones están ligadas a una red criminal que lavaba dinero a través de empresas en conexión con México y Colombia, y que estas detenciones respondían precisamente a esta investigación criminal. Y justo ahí es donde hoy pondremos el foco. ¿Qué papel juega México en estos disturbios en Los Ángeles? ¿Es un actor clave detrás de este telón? Para responder a esa pregunta, hoy nos acompaña el periodista John Daniel Davidson, editor senior en The Federalist y autor de un reciente artículo titulado México es cómplice en los disturbios de Los Ángeles y debe haber consecuencias. Esta fue mi entrevista con John. John Daniel Davidson, welcome to Desde el Capitolio. Thank you for joining us. John, we've all seen images in recent days of masked protesters waving the Mexican flag, burning U.S. flags, setting vehicles in fire, vandalizing property during these riots in Los Angeles. John, based on your article, do you believe the Mexican government is playing an active role in this protest? And if so, how exactly do you think that influence is being carried out on U.S. soil?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it really depends on what we mean by the Mexican government, right? Part of what I'm laying out in this article, and I've been writing about this for many years, is that over the past decade, the Mexican government itself, say the political establishment in Mexico City, has really been infiltrated and in some ways has melded with the cartel organizations that control a lot of Mexico and that really have control over migration out of Mexico and into the United States, especially over the past 4 years of the Biden administration. That was when illegal immigration really almost got like industrialized because the cartels figured out how to make money off of it. And so elements of the Mexican government and the Mexican state are involved in this. And so when figures like Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, last month called for or threatened protests over, stricter immigration enforcement in the United States or taxes on remittances to Mexico, That's a real threat from a head of state, against the U.S. Government trying to enforce U.S. immigration law and trying to get a handle on our border situation. So, yes, I do believe, and I cited two things yesterday in my article. One was a statement from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Mexico City, basically denouncing attempts to enforce immigration law in Los Angeles. And then the statements that we saw from Claudia Sheinbaum. Now she's changed her tune today. Now she's saying, don't engage in violence. We don't condone rioting, anything like that. I think part of that's coming from the pushback she's gotten, but there's a long history to this, to Mexico essentially meddling in the internal affairs of the United States for its own purposes and for its own reasons, especially when it comes to the immigration issue. And we can go through some of that history if you like.
Right, yes. So before touching that history of Mexican interference or influence in U.S. oil, we also heard something important from Tom Homan, the U.S. border czar. He said ICE actually was not doing immigration raids last Friday, and instead they were arresting people as part of a criminal investigation into customs fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, linked to Mexico and Colombia. What's your reaction on that? Does it connect in any way to the protests we're seeing now?
Yeah, it's very interesting, this statement from Tom Homan, that this was an operation, a long-running investigation that was targeting cartel-connected money laundering operations in Los Angeles. It wasn't immigration raids that supposedly sparked these protests, which I find is very interesting. I hate to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but when it comes to the Mexican state, and especially to the Morena political party, really that AMLO created and that Claudia Sheinbaum has inherited, the connections between those political figures in that party and some of these major cartels in Mexico, especially the Sinaloa cartel, are really deep connections that go back decades. They go back to the beginning of Lopez Obrador's, first bid for the Mexican presidency in 2006. And so the idea that there are high-ranking Mexican officials that would take issue with the Trump administration going after cartel operations, especially money laundering operations in the United States, is not a far-fetched conspiracy theory. There's ample reason to believe that that's exactly the kind of thing that certain elements within the Morena regime would want to oppose and would want to provoke a kind of international incident over, and would be okay making common cause with leftists in the United States who are sort of for open borders and against all immigration enforcement over this kind of things, the targeting of cartel businesses and cartel operations in the United States.
Right, and today in Congress, we asked Representative Adriano Espaillat about Claudia Sheinbaum's description of the LA Mexican protesters that she referred to as heroes. And this is what he said. He said, quote, "The Mexican president is entitled to her opinion. Trump wants to rename the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. How about that? Is that hemispheric interference? He has opinions about practically every country in the world." And also, Representative Nanette Barragan said Sheinbaum's remarks referred to only peaceful protesters. Is that right? What really constitutes peaceful protests?
Well, where are all these peaceful protesters? There are no peaceful protests in Los Angeles. There are riots. This started, with people confronting ICE agents who were conducting raids connected to this investigation that we were discussing, and then surrounding the federal detention facility in downtown Los Angeles, trying to obstruct agents, really actually trying to barricade agents within the building. That's not a peaceful protest right off the bat. There is no peaceful protest when you're interfering with federal law enforcement conducting lawful raids, lawful arrests, and doing their duty, trying to enforce U.S. immigration law. So this whole narrative is kind of it's a lie. The narrative that this is in opposition to immigration raids, as if ICE agents are going into families' homes and like ripping children out of their mother's arms. I know the left loves that narrative, but that's not actually what's happening here. What's happening is this is a coordinated political action, what the left calls direct political action, to thwart the Trump administration's attempts to enforce U.S. immigration law and shut down illegal immigration. And the reason that the cartels would oppose this, and the reason that cartel-connected elements within the Mexican government would oppose it, is because this is very profitable business that was going all during the Biden administration. 10 million illegal immigrants coming across the U.S.-Mexico border. Almost every one of them were paying cartels and cartel-affiliated smuggling organizations. That's a lot of money to dry up really quick under the Trump administration, and I think part of what we're seeing is pushback against that.
And John, some will say that the waving of the Mexican flag at the protests, it might be something cultural, or identity, maybe immigrant rights. Do you think it's being used as that, or maybe as a political tool? Is the waving of the American flag during this protest sort of a trigger to start violence?
I tend to think it's the latter. You don't go out and stand on top of a wrecked car surrounded by burning debris in a riot zone, waving the flag of a foreign country with a mask on after you've engaged in street violence as a just cultural symbol. I noticed that the New York Times and the Washington Post and other corporate media outlets are trying to frame this as it. I think most Americans think that's laughable. And we understand that in the context of a riot, in the context of attacks against police officers and burning vehicles, that waving the flag of a foreign country is a very aggressive political statement. And I'm actually shocked that the Mexican government, just on purely a PR level, didn't immediately come out and distance itself from that kind of a thing. They did the opposite. They seemed to embrace it. Now they're trying to walk it back a little bit. But I think ordinary Americans look at that and they're absolutely repelled by it when you have people engaging in this kind of activity together with the waving of a foreign flag on U.S. soil. Many people's reaction is, look, if you feel such close connection to Mexico and to the Mexican state and the Mexican nation, then you should go live in Mexico and don't wave a Mexican flag on American soil.
Now, it's been reported that more protests are expected to happen this Saturday. John, if lives are lost, does it become a border war?
Well, arguably, we are already in a border war. It's just that one side, our side, hasn't acknowledged it. And that's been the case for years. When you have millions of people being trafficked into the United States, along with mass amounts of deadly illegal narcotics, that's a hostile action. And the cartels did it in cooperation with elements of the Mexican state, especially the National Guard and INM, both of which I think we should properly think of as migrant trafficking organizations. And that is a fact that's been well established. It's been widely reported on. Anyone who has done what I've done and gone to Mexico and reported on these things knows that the Mexican National Guard is a trafficking organization. So the elements of a border war have been there for a long time. And I think the difference is that the Trump administration is actually taking that seriously. And hopefully they respond in kind, because you can't continue on the path that we were on with the Biden administration with 10 million people coming in the course of 4 years. That will collapse any democracy, that level of illegal immigration.
Now, let's discuss solutions. Are there any? You have the governor of the state of California and the mayor of Los Angeles supporting the protesters. The Marines are being sent in. So how far will this go? And what do you think the United States can do to counter that kind of influence from Mexico that you describe in your article?
Yeah, there's two things here. One is on the domestic side. How does this go in California with Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, and what does the Trump administration do to restore order in Los Angeles and sort of do what the Democratic leadership in California refuses to do? I think there's overwhelming domestic political support for a massive escalation and force dominance on the part of the federal authorities in Los Angeles, and I think Trump knows that, and I think he's going to pursue the restoration of order at all costs. And the American people are behind him, especially after the 2020 riots. There's really no appetite among your ordinary American citizen for rioting and violence in the streets. That's the domestic part of it. On the foreign part of it, in terms of our U.S. relations with Mexico, the number one thing the Trump administration can do to get concessions from the Sheinbaum government is to use the reauthorization of the USMCA trade agreement, which is up for reauthorization next July, and negotiations for that will be beginning this fall, to use that trade agreement to extract major concessions from the Mexican government to really crack down on cross-border crime and migrant trafficking and drug trafficking, and really give the Mexican regime a choice. You can side with the cartels and you can partner with the cartels and see how that goes for you, or you can partner with the U.S. and start actually acting like a neighbor and a friend and an ally, and prosper with a great free trade agreement. We have enormous leverage with our trade deals with Mexico. Mexico relies on U.S. trade for the sustenance of its economy, and so we hold all the cards there. And I think it just takes leadership in Washington, D.C. to really make that known to our Mexican counterparts.
And John, some people are just scared of being deported when it comes to this massive raids. How would you tell the difference between a peaceful protester and outside agitators?
If you attack the police, you're not a peaceful protester. If you throw rocks at the police, if you throw bricks at them from highway overpasses, if you rush at police lines, if you loot stores, then you're not a peaceful protester. Peaceful protesters hold signs and march. That's what peaceful protesters do. So if you're not doing that, you should expect to be arrested, and you should deserve to be arrested.
What do you think is next for these upcoming days? Do you think the situation in Los Angeles will slow down or will get worse?
I don't know. These situations are so dynamic and fluid, and there's obviously a lot of people fomenting this and funding it on the left. These aren't organic protests. This was planned. I think the goal for the people who organize these protests and who are fueling them is that these kinds of riots and violence would spread to other U.S. cities as a way to kind of resist the Trump administration. So I don't know. It could go one of two ways. The federal authorities could button things up in Los Angeles with overwhelming force and suppress the rioters and looters and people who are causing trouble, or this could become a conflagration that spreads to other U.S. cities. And in that case, we have a real problem on our hands, and the Trump administration is going to have to show very firm fortitude and resolve to put down riots. Again, as I said earlier, the American people have no appetite or tolerance, the majority of Americans, for any kind of rioting or street violence.
John, who are these organizations funding this protest? Is Mexico the only government supposedly doing so?
Well, the Mexican government is the primary government because, as I said, of their symbiotic relationship with these cartels. But the cartels themselves have ties to, major left-wing organizations that have been active in the United States for a long time. Under the banner, the last time we saw these kinds of riots, it was organizations like BLM and various Antifa groups. But there are additional groups that received U.S. funding, I should say, under the Biden administration. And that includes groups like Catholic Charities and some of these Lutheran and Episcopal ministries that received huge multi-million-dollar grants from the Biden administration to resettle refugees. Now, what those operations really were, in many cases, were part of a trafficking network that extended from the Mexico-Guatemala border all the way up into U.S. cities, major U.S. cities all across the South and the West. Those organizations are part of this network, and many of them are currently under investigation by ICE for their complicity in migrant trafficking, knowingly trafficking migrants who had been brought into the United States through these cartel networks. It's a huge problem, and at this point, we're just really kind of scratching the surface of it. The incoming Trump administration is just scratching the surface of it.
John Daniel Davidson from The Federalist, thank you so much for your insight, and I hope this is not the last time. It's a very interesting perspective. Thank you.
My pleasure. Would love to talk again. Thank you.
¿Y usted qué opina sobre lo que dice John Davidson? ¿Está de acuerdo con su postura? ¿Cree que realmente hay un gobierno detrás de estas manifestaciones en Los Ángeles o simplemente son manifestantes ondeando la bandera mexicana? Los leo debajo en sus comentarios. Gracias por acompañarnos en este episodio y como siempre recuerde seguirnos en todas nuestras redes sociales buscándonos con Desde el Capitolio. También lo invito a darle me gusta a este video y dejar sus opiniones debajo y compartir esta entrevista con su familia y todos sus amigos. Y si aún no se ha suscrito a este canal, hágalo ahora y no olvide activar las notificaciones para estar siempre informado sobre lo que sucede aquí en Washington, D.C. y cómo afecta a nuestra comunidad hispana. Yo soy Pachi Valencia y nos vemos mañana con más información desde el Capitolio. Buenas noches.